Well, thank you so much to the author, Dan Markey, for inviting me. I will have to explain to the audience that I actually am not a Central Asia expert, but I do I've worked on China Central Asian relations. And so um, this is a wonderful opportunity to address a topic that has interested me for a long time. Actually, Dan's book as a whole addresses a topic that's interested me as I've studied China from my very earliest days, and that is how China manages its relations with the countries along its very complex periphery. Today, of course, that comprises 14 territorial neighbors and others that it sees that it sees as in its maritime periphery. Whether those countries see themselves as in China's periphery is another issue. For me, studying China's relations, particularly with its territorial neighbors, gives some focus to a space in Chinese foreign policy where, in a way, just because it's where the sovereign borders of nation states meet, the rubber kind of meets the road in Chinese foreign and security policy. So it's always been very fascinating. And frontiers or peripheries are always a preoccupation of countries' foreign policies, countries with numerous neighbors. And this is certainly the case for China, which has spent a lot of its long history as a polity under the imperial domination of non-Chinese, non-Han people who've come from along its periphery. Of course, most recently during the period of the Qing dynasty, which was a dynasty founded by the Manchus who conquered China from their homes, north of China's Great Wall, and also, of course, the Mongol Yuan of Genghis Khan fame was another conquering foreign dynasty, which lasted from the 13th through the 14th century. So China is always concerned about how changes in its periphery and in neighboring countries and nearby peoples can affect it and its own internal security. So as a China specialist, I've focused a lot on how China engages in its foreign policy along its borders and what the mechanisms are. And Dan's book reminds us that a key part of that of the dynamic that I've been exploring, despite China's huge size and its historical role as the region's most powerful actor, is that China doesn't act unilaterally, and the actions of its generally weaker neighbors alone or in concert with others, including sometimes big powers, Russia and the United States, very much affect the kinds of tools that Beijing can use to achieve its goals. I think last time you had a speaker, you had Professor White, who is an expert on South Asia, and he looks most closely looking at China, at how China's policies are affecting that region, and then those countries' responses and influence on how China promotes its own security. So in a way, he gave you an opportunity to explore in much greater detail how those countries deal with China. Since I'm a China specialist, I'm going to stay on the Chinese side of the border for my 10 minutes or so of remarks. And I'll offer you some insights into China's perspective on and its foreign policy towards Central Asia, with to the extent possible reference to Kazakhstan, which is the country that Dan devotes most of his attention to in his book. So first, let me make a few general comments about Chinese foreign policy toward its periphery, specifically toward those countries with which it shares territorial borders, and then a few comments about China's relations with Central Asia in particular. First, speaking in broad terms about China's foreign policy toward its periphery, China's goals, I'll say, are basically threefold. It wants a stable periphery, so it prefers political stability and ideally a healthy economy in countries along its borders. It wants a China-friendly periphery focused mainly for its purposes at the government level of the country, so it wants governments friendly to it and its interests, and it wants a periphery over which ideally it exerts the most influence of any foreign country in that in that neighboring country, or at least enough influence to secure its national interests. After the end of colonialism in the middle of the last century, China recognized that many of its borders with neighboring countries were contested and worked to resolve many of those. And then after the Cold War, new parts of China's international borders reemerged as disputed zones, including its borders with the post-Soviet Central Asian states, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, with which China shares about a 3,300 kilometer border. China gave a great deal of attention in the immediate post-Cold War period to resolving those disputes. And that enabled China to start cross-border trade with those countries, which allowed China to share the benefits of its own growth and development, if you will, with those neighbors. And also in specific reference to Central Asia, to begin to develop its own independent ties with states that had been part of the Soviet Empire. In managing its periphery, China is acutely aware that it's dealing with complexity and a lot of potential instability. It's dealing with countries like North Korea, Afghanistan, Pakistan, as well as a lot more: Bhutan, Nepal, Laos, Mongolia, Myanmar, Vietnam, as well as India, Russia, and the Central Asian states, the three I mentioned. It's also acutely aware that it can't walk itself away from problems in any of those countries. So given all of those factors, it's not surprising that China pursues policies that take a long view, that try to minimize costs, or put another way, that draw on those resources that it has in greatest supply, and tries to seek to create conditions where ties with its neighbors are constructive, or as China likes to say, win-win, for both sides, and that it can use to exert leverage on those countries with minimal cost to itself. And you can take some examples from tensions between China and countries where it has maritime disputes. For example, China stopped importing Filipino bananas to send a strong sign to the Philippines about its pursuit of its territorial claims, overlapping claims with China. For this reason, economic ties, commerce, and investment have been key instruments of Chinese foreign relations. And now, as China's academic and technological prowess has become increasingly world-class and also indigenous, so you're talking about Chinese industrial standards, for example, China is working to, as I think Dan talks about in his book, educate elites and train technicians in neighboring societies in China, in Chinese institutions. And again, where China needs to, and the costs for it are acceptable, it will utilize its commercial relations as leverage to achieve its goals. But it can't just rely on commercial relations and sociocultural ties to achieve all of its interests. So it uses its other capabilities, whether these are surveillance or military, and it's been expanding this dimension of its relationship with some countries. And indeed, to Professor Markey's point, this is necessary given the nature of some of the regimes where not only is military security a key aspect of China's interests, but the military is a key actor in those regimes. For example, Pakistan. In Pakistan, where the military plays a key role in the state. China also uses multilateral fora to advance its interests by it's an opportunity for it to showcase its leadership and also to distribute resources, which it increasingly labels public goods, promoting its preferred norms, like the norm of non-interference in national affairs, for example, and pursuing specific policy objectives. You can think about the six-party talks with respect to North Korea, but also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization for Central Asia, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Central Asia is a particularly interesting focus for Chinese foreign policy for a couple of reasons, but I'll just highlight three in particular, all of which relate to China's general goals for its periphery. First, regional stability is a big preoccupation of China's, with big concerns about spillover from the region into its Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. following Central Asian independence from the Soviet Union. Of course, Central Asia, there's a lot of instability in Central Asia. It became a zone for drug trafficking networks, national corruption, brittle kleptocratic central political, highly centralized political regimes, and also a potential zone for radical Islamic terrorism. And the region is fractured by inter-ethnic tensions that actually caused a civil war in Tajikistan in the early to mid 1990s. So that all of that has spilled into intra-regional tensions in the region. And China's been fearful that that all of these issues could which remain endemic to the region, although have been managed in many respects, could spill into Xinjiang. Second, ingrained political and social suspicion across Central Asia has been a real challenge to China's goals of having countries in the region that are friendly to its interests. There were anti-Chinese protests, for example, in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan a decade ago, and these, again, I think in 2019. Finally, China seeks a periphery with countries friendly to its interests. And in Central Asia, it has had to compete with the region's traditional hegemon, Russia. And since the end of the Cold War, and especially after 9/11, when the US became a factor in the region, it had to be careful that the US didn't become too entrenched. But Russia is also a neighbor, and China, a neighboring country with which China shares a very long border. So China also needs to manage its relationship with Russia very carefully for all of the same goals that it has for other parts of its periphery as well. So how has China pursued its interests in Central Asia? It's done this through three main channels. First, it's deepened economic ties, and that has largely been through energy relations with the energy exporting countries in the region. But we've also seen it now through, especially since the start of BRI, through infrastructure investments and other types of investments related to the Belt and Road Initiative. Second, it's tried to improve perceptions of Central Asians about China. When it's built roads, it's branded them so it's clear that it's the source. This has proven very popular in many communities. It's China Telecom Global has been a force in expanding bandwidth, et cetera. So there are ways that China has shown that it's providing public goods. Scholarships for Central Asian students to study and train in China is another good that China has provided to the region to boost its prestige, its standing in the region. And finally, it's tried to boost its political influence and ability to play a more direct role in regional security, to address its concerns about instability, especially terrorism, without seeming to push Russia out of the region. And it's done this deftly through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which it established with Russia in the mid-1980s, formally in the 2000s. It had a different name earlier, to combat the quote-unquote three evil forces of terrorism, separatism, and extremism. So a very clear mission statement. And all Central Asian countries are members except Turkmenistan, and China has expanded the SCO to include 8 countries. And since it was established, the SCO has become a channel for joint counterterrorism exercises amongst countries in the region. And though Russia remains the dominant player in the region in terms of conventional military cooperation, increasingly China is selling weapons and cooperating directly with Central Asian states on security issues. Now, very quickly, how effective is this approach? China's economic ties are deepening, and its BRI has brought considerable new growth to the region, but the dependence on China has its risks for the region. COVID-19 has hit the regional economies hard, and China has suspended or at least slowed some of its energy imports from the region, which has been difficult for regional countries. In addition, on the positive side, China's BRI has sparked new regional ambitions. For example, in Kazakhstan, which has been uncomfortable with its rising debt to China, and also and just generally concerned about its dependency on the Chinese economy, has been trying to diversify, given its new role as a transit hub between China and in Europe, in Eurasia. It even has visions of becoming a financial hub for the BRI. In terms of image, to date, leaders in the region have largely embraced Chinese interests and looked the other way at, for example, repression in Xinjiang. And there's no real indication that repression itself is a major source of concern in the region. It's at least not a broad source of concern. What is a concern for many is sort of a possible paranoia, but a sense that China's strengthened grip in Xinjiang could be a sign that China has expansionist ambitions in the region, and that's created some tensions. And finally, China's growing hold and increasing military ties in the region have raised some concerns in Russia, although the China-Russia relationship is very strong, particularly as US-Russia-China tensions rise. There are concerns among Russians that Chinese military capabilities, growing ties in the region, could end up competing with Russian influence in the region. Symbolic features of the China Central Asian relationship, for example, the fact that Kazakhstan's president Tokayev speaks Chinese and had served actually in the Soviet embassy in China. Things like that do worry Russians. There are other concerns that are more complicated, but as Central Asia becomes an important hub, in part thanks to BRI and the new infrastructure, it's attracting attention from other powers in the region, and includes India, a growing player in the region. And this complicates China's goal of exercising dominant influence over the region. So I went on too long, but I'll stop there and look forward to some questions. Oh, thank you for the question. It's a very important question and one that's on, I think, everyone's minds as they look at the region. The US had made considerable inroads in the region, of course, in the wake of 9/11, forging important security relationships with the region, and also playing a role, actually, that in some ways China is playing today by encouraging interregional cooperation and promoting a new Silk Road concept, actually. But to date, right now, our relationship with the region is not, I think, competitive with China's. We have used concerns about China's repression in Xinjiang to try to boost solidarity. Secretary of State Pompeo was recently, I believe, in Kazakhstan with that message. Although he was warmly received, there really is no indication that the Kazakh government is going to embrace an and sort of pro-human rights, anti-China posture. So to compete effectively, the United States is going to have to bring more goodies to the table, and right now we're not doing that. China and Russia, partly because of the tensions, the growing hostilities, I'd say, between China and the United States, and also tensions between the U.S. and Russia. That dynamic has brought China and Russia closer together. And although they're not natural partners or allies, they keep increasing their security cooperation. And there are intellectuals in China who have been lobbying for a return to sort of the Sino-Russian alliance, the Sino-Soviet alliance that ended in the 1960s, to restore that in the face of U.S. hostility. So right now, that although I think Russia is concerned that it is losing ground to China in the region, and there is what I described in one paper as latent rivalry between China and Russia in the region right now, given the the broader geopolitical set of dynamics, it would be very difficult to pry the two countries apart. Just finally, very quickly, though as I indicated with Kazakhstan, these countries are very interested in diversifying their relationships. So certainly they would be very willing to have more involvement from the United States, as they would. And indeed, Kazakhstan is lobbying hard to bring in more European partners into its economy and its international relationships. Well, I think going to my point, sort of about China's general approach to its foreign policy, it uses the tools that it has the most of to minimize cost to itself. Of course, as its instruments of military security power grow, it can be expected to, I would say, use those to both protect its economic interests and also push on core interests like its territorial interests more strongly. We certainly see that in the South China Sea, where China is certainly using its military resources to promote its interests. And I think that does worry countries in Central Asia, and I think watching in China's growing military competencies, and knowing that China now is moving into the peer competitor zone with the United States, there are latent fears there's a latent xenophobia and fears of Chinese expansionism, maybe sort of visceral because of centuries of being concerned about that. But I think that the leaders of these countries, as long as they are in power, and again, these are brittle regimes, they have close military ties with Russia, and so this will they will continue to. They kind of have Russia at their back, and so they have that support. It is, if there were any disruption in their relations with Russia, which is on that side, which is hard to imagine, that you could see China moving in to fill the vacuum, concerned about instability, or even players like India strengthening their own security ties in the region. I think right now the regimes are capable of adequate repression. That those some popular sentiments have not been able to grow, or are not a major political factor. But I think that something could happen, and as China's policies in Xinjiang persist, and as more and more people in Central Asia with family or other ties to the region are affected, it certainly could become a political issue. But right now, I don't think it's anything that it's not going to be a major driving factor in policy. Well, remember, Central Asia, these were Soviet republics, so they know the Marxist-Leninist system very well, and these regimes did not sustain single party regimes styled after Bolshevism or after the Chinese model. But it's hard to imagine any of these countries returning to that. But I suppose, if would be a very interesting research question to see just how receptive countries would be to embracing a sort of a new Marxist-Leninist single party structure. But it's an interesting question. Right, so that a lot of our recent interest in the region has related to our role in Afghanistan, and so it's hard to decide whether we will have if we manage to extricate ourselves from Afghanistan, what our interests in Central Asia exactly would be, and it would probably be difficult to justify long-term interest unless we have a real vision for the region and want to be part of this a vision for Eurasian connectivity that really China and the region is excited about. I mean, we do have significant investments. I think the U.S. oil companies, for example, were the first to get involved in the region, and there are definitely economic interests. But right now, we haven't been playing a significant role in partnering, even with Japanese investors and others in the Eurasian connectivity schemes that exist. And if we don't have good economic ties with China, it's unclear, because China would be the end of the road, so to speak. It's unclear why we would want to make those investments. Right. So yes, exactly. China is an energy insecure country, and a lot of its interests in Central Asia have been energy driven, trying to diversify its energy supplies. But there's going to be a long way. It's a long road to developing resources, to developing renewable resources that could meet the demands of the Chinese economy. So I think it would be quite a while before that happened. And meanwhile, certainly Central Asia is courting new energy partners. And remember, it also was an important and continues to be a source of energy for Europe via Russian pipelines. So, but I think it's going to be decades before China is able to become energy self-sufficient using solely relying on renewable energy resources. But maybe I'll be wrong, but it does seem like a very ambitious goal. But thank you